You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. On July 24th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu successfully voted through the first step of a judicial overhaul. The new law would strip the rights of Supreme Court justices to challenge the decision of Israeli cabinet members. And it's one of the most contentious proposals in Israel's 75-year history. In response, thousands of protesters, eventually tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, flooded the streets of Jerusalem and other Israeli cities, blocking access to the Knesset, Israel's parliament.
Protesters not able to get near the parliament because of the police, but protesters spilling right down the roads. There is real anger on the streets of Jerusalem right now.
Many fear this hardline policy is following a trend of strongman, authoritarian-style leadership in the Middle East and elsewhere, and that it speaks to a particularly precarious moment of uncertainty for U.S. interests in the region. Since the 2021 withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and the years of significant drawdown in Iraq, there have been notable changes in Middle East geopolitics. OPEC's 2023 cut to oil production undermined Western sanctions on Russia. China brokered the surprise Iran-Saudi pact, a step toward resolution of the proxy war in Yemen. And Syria has been reinstated to the Arab League. Israel's pursuit of an increasingly nationalist agenda, despite U.S. and UN protestations, is just the latest headline from the region. How countries in the Middle East realign themselves is anyone's guess. But in mid-July, World Affairs hosted a live event to talk about the current shakeup and how the U.S. should rebalance its influence in an era of retrenchment. To help answer these questions, we'll share an excerpt from my conversation with Mara Rudman, Executive Vice President for Policy at American Progress. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's World Affairs program. I'm here with Mara Rudman. She served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Her government positions have included Deputy Envoy and Chief of Staff for the Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace at the State Department, and Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She was also appointed to the 2022 National Defense Strategy Commission. Mara Rudman, welcome to World Affairs.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Let's start by looking all the way back to the beginning of your time in the Clinton White House. If you look at America's way of seeing the world, the country's assumptions about the Middle East, key alliances and partnerships in the region, what's changed between then and now?
Many of the relationships have stayed quite similar, and some have grown and strengthened in terms of the Middle East, countries in the Middle East. Some may have waxed and waned over the years, but there's actually a remarkable amount of consistency from President Clinton's administration to President Bush's to President Obama, more variation during Trump's presidency, but also some similarities there. I think where the biggest changes have come is more in the global context in terms of where President Clinton's team may have thought or predicted the world was going in terms of where we were with Russia, where we were with China, and the changes from 2000, later in the Bush administration, even in kind of recognizing, I would say, the extent to which we were in very direct and intense competition with China and what that meant for our relationships in other regions. So I wouldn't say that contributed to the waxing and waning, but it was part of the calculation on what was going to be very important and where and how the United States reinforced country-specific and regional relationships, understanding what Russia and China were doing at the same time and how it affected the United States' relationships with those two countries as well.
Thinking back to the Clinton years, of course, it was before 9/11, before the twin invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, before the Arab Spring, before the Syrian civil war. Which countries are seen in a different way by the U.S., and which countries regard the U.S., its intentions, its usefulness, its interests, in a different way now And given what you just said, in part because there are other players like China.
So I would say that if we're talking again about countries in the Middle East specifically, and I would qualify just a bit in the sense that we were not on the ground at war with Iraq or with Afghanistan, but in the Clinton administration, there was a lot of back and forth and significant tensions with Iraq. There was the al-Qaeda threat, things that led to both U.S. interventions in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So it wasn't those things weren't on the plate or the horizon in any way during the Clinton years. But I would say that the relationship with every country in the region, I would say in one way or another with every country in the world, is affected by how the United States, China, Russia act or react. I mean, if you just take as an example the Abraham Accords that were put together under President Trump, though I will say based on a lot of legwork that was done in previous administrations, President Obama's and President Bush's administrations. But if you look at the Abraham Accord countries, countries that have various degrees of agreement or understanding with Israel at this point, and countries like Saudi Arabia, that the parties in the Abraham Accords are very interested in expanding to include Saudi Arabia. And you just did a press search of where China is and what the degree of different Chinese interventions, relationships, deals with each of those countries. If you looked at it 20 years ago and you looked at it now, remarkable difference of intensity and engagement from China.
After events of recent years, do countries in the region look at the U.S. as a reliable partner, either as an adversary across the negotiating table, as it was in Geneva with the JCPOA, the effort to stop Iran's nuclear program, or if you're a Kurd in northern Syria, abandoned to the tender mercies of the Turks and the Assad regime, if you're part of the federal state of Iraq and wondering in the far northwest if the little freedom, the little breathing space that you've carved out for yourself under American oversight is really safe. Where do you end up? Can you be sure that from one administration to another, America's assurances, its backing, its approach is going to remain at least somewhat consistent?
So, Ray, the thing is, I wouldn't say that, and I don't think you're suggesting that's a phenomenon of the last 20 years. Some of the challenge inherent in the United States being a democracy where the president gets elected or reelected every 4 years, and the Congress, the House of Representatives switches every 2 years, and the Senate every 2 years, but 6-year terms in the Senate, and that for treaties or agreements, they need to go through the Senate, not just the executive branch. All of the funding that supports the commitments we make need to get enacted through Congress. So it has long been among the challenges. I happen to believe there are a lot of benefits of being a democracy that outweigh those challenges, but it is a challenge of folks in other countries, and I would say particularly countries that perhaps don't have the same kind of systems that we have, to question what our reliability is. It is also the changes between administrations are more extreme, let me put it that way. And I think some of what's happened is that as a society in this country, and it's a phenomenon that's happening all over the world, there's a lot of various elements that are driving politics to extremes. I don't think driving people to extremes, because I think if you look at most people in, for example, in the United States and how they vote and what their mindset is in most polls, most people in the country are actually in the middle of the spectrum. There's a lot of things that drive politics and media and what people listen to the extremes. I think that has made the shift in administrations in the United States more jarring to the outside world. In other words, it's meant that, to your point, like in the last 20 years, as those elements of our politics have been driven to the extremes, I think it's made for more abrupt changes from administration to administration in how we engage internationally as well as domestically. And that is a huge challenge for countries all over the world. And I think there are various things we could change or adjust in our system, while still absolutely a democratic system, to build in more reliability. I think we have to in making those changes, also be able to explain to the American people why it would be important to make long-lasting or multi-year commitments to different countries in various ways. But that starts from doing a better job of explaining it at home.
Well, sometimes we ask opposite numbers in other countries to do hard things, to take risks, to stick their necks out.
Often we ask them.
And can we do that?
Yes, we have to be able to.
And make some assurances that we're going to stick with it.
Yes, but it's also important. We should make assurances, ideally, that we can live up to, because people are not going to. The risks that we ask leaders to take, that, to be clear, I hope we ask them to take because we believe it's in their interest or their country's interest as well as in the United States' interest. Some of the job when you're in a diplomat seat or in a political leader's seat, not seats I occupy currently, but I used to think of it as no matter what, the leader in another country is going to be taking a significant personal risk or risk to their future, or in some cases, we've seen in the Middle East as a good example, risks that cost them their lives in the statements and the positions they take. The United States can never entirely erase the risk that the leader is taking. What we can do is try to mitigate as much as possible the distance that they have to leap, the amount of risk. And we have imperfect options for doing so.
Taking a look at recent months' headlines, Saudi Arabia seems to be pushing some of its old assumptions aside. Turkey has grown richer, more powerful, more willing to throw its weight around in the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia. Is a big part of the change that you've seen during your career simply an outgrowth of the fact that now the U.S. has company and the countries in the region have options?
I think it's the behavior of different countries is based on a range of issues. We have upturns and downturns in the degree to which the United States power is unrivaled. So the 90s and probably early 2000s were unusual in that sense. If you look at the overall over time, China has been building steadily and very rapidly, some would say exponentially since then, and probably earlier than then in what they're able to do. And Russia has declined, though still is, as our national defense strategy and national security strategy describes them, is an acute competitor, but is not where it was when the Cold War that was between the United States and Russia was at its height. So many other countries in the world are often in one way leveraging opportunities from where the various players are. But I think leaders of any country, anywhere in the world, part of getting to be leaders is figuring out what their politics are. And whether democracies or not, you have to be good at politics and who's up and who's down and who you can leverage off of whom else to get what you need, either for yourself or for your country or hopefully for the people of your country.
I'm glad you brought up the contrast in fortunes between Russia and China. In the Clinton years, Russia was in turmoil. A lot of countries were holding their breath out of fear of an unstable, unpredictable, poor, restless nuclear basket case. And China hadn't yet accomplished its remarkable rise and wasn't much of a factor outside of its own neighborhood. Fast forward 25 years, and China is involved in pioneering a new kind of soft power, and Russia, well, I mean, if you want to go look at Syria and what Russia's old-fashioned use of hard power looks like, they're Groznying parts of Syria. They still matter in a weird kind of way, but nobody thinks of Russia as the country of the future. How do you thread the needle there? These are two countries that will continue to challenge the United States, but with very, very different strengths and weaknesses.
I actually do think on this, again, our national security strategy put out close to the beginning of each administration, maybe in the first year and a half, captures it well in describing China as a pacing competitor and Russia as an acute competitor. In other words, the challenges we have from Russia and what Russia is doing in Ukraine, by way of example or illustration, are acute, quite significant, and they are a major nuclear power. They are a country with endless amount of people that they're willing to throw into battle, into combat, as we're seeing in Ukraine. So a serious and acute threat. China, the reason I would describe, I think the wording pacing competitor is wise, is that, as you described, Ray, they are on a trajectory of growth, of leverage, of expansion, and the expansion of their role in the world. And their leader has been very clear about what their goals are, which is ultimately domination. I would say it's not just through soft power, though. I would describe it as gray zone conflict, as they've been really smart and strategic on how they have used economic means, non-kinetic means, not directly, physical conflict, to gain strength, to gain power, to gain information that they can then leverage in various ways. At the same time, and let's be clear, they have been steadily building their military power, their hard power. They've not just left that behind. They've just been working in a very steady way. I would say that Russia will continue to be a factor that we should not discount. At the same time that they are, as you note, expending tremendous resources, blood and treasure, in what they're doing in Ukraine and how they are doing it.
Are Americans making a mistake if they don't watch closely what other countries in the Middle East are deciding about Russia? You mentioned that Americans tend to see it in black and white, good and bad, evil versus good terms. It seems like there's something much more nuanced going on in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, in Egypt, the countries of the old non-aligned world, the countries of the global south, much less willing to enter a harsh judgment against Russia for what it's doing.
Yes, I agree with you that it's a mistake whenever we see things in black or white and in kind of stark terms without seeing most issues on a continuum. I also think that there are many political leaders who benefit by presenting things in what I would describe as inherently fundamentalist terms, the right and wrong, the black and white. So the United States is not unique in having those kinds of views or in people being drawn to those kinds of conclusions. I think just as when you judge individuals by who they are, as opposed to trying to cubbyhole in particular ways, it's really important when we're dealing with other countries. I think there's a similar psychology in the sense that, at least I try, nothing I succeed, but to understand the history of the country I'm dealing with, how they come to where they are, who are their stakeholders, who else are they dealing with in various ways, how did the particular leader who's there get to be there, and who does he or she depend on? And they're going to be playing all of those factors. I don't think that that's new. I think that maybe what is new or newer for some people in the United States maybe to appreciate is how many different factors a leader in a given country has at play. And if you're, for example, if you're in any country in the Middle East right now, what kind of Chinese investments do you have? What is Russia supplying you? If you're South Africa, what's been your relationship with Russia and what have they delivered to you? And in terms of things you need over last 10 years versus what do you perceive the United States has done for you and with you? And so when you're asked at the UN to take a vote against Russia on the resolution about Ukraine very early in the conflict, it may not be so automatic for you that the right vote is the vote the United States and Europeans are pushing when it's a vote against Russia, and there may be stuff you depend on directly in Russia. And I could play that out for you in every country in the Middle East in one way or another with Russia or China.
Well, pursuant to that, how big a role does, for want of a better term, American druthers about human rights, about elected governments, about arms sales play in determining this country's relationships with the many countries in that region? If you're ready to rethink who your friends are there ways in which an opening to China or Russia is just easier? They're not going to bother you about transparency, about bidding processes, about how many political prisoners you've got locked up. Is it just easier?
I think there are trade-offs always, right, in who you're going to do a deal with and what you're going to get for the deal. And would also say I think the United States would do better and be more effective if we did less lecturing, more showing than telling. So some of that is who we do deals with. The other is making sure that we deliver on what we promised, to the questions you raised earlier in our conversation, to position ourselves as an attractive partner in as many ways as possible that are obviously consistent with our values and our interests. And sometimes we do that well, many times maybe less well. So I think I would give us a room for improvement on that score. I would actually view the aggressiveness with which, like, let's say China in particular is pursuing deals in various parts of Latin America and the African continent and the Middle East, but frankly, more in kind of the direct stuff they need right now in different countries in Africa, for example. But they've been at it for a long time. They signed a bunch of these deals some years ago on terms that were actually pretty bad for the countries involved. But as you know, deals got signed fast. I'm sure a bunch of people got very rich very quickly who had signed those deals. And now payments are literally coming due in ways that cause significant harm, for sure, to the people of the countries involved, but also to some of the leaders who are now responsible for paying those deals. That's a window of opportunity for the United States or Europe or others to come in with better deals.
Is there a risk that China might overplay its hand? It seems that in some of these places where the countries are either perilously close to default or are already technically in default, China is not doing what it first threatened, which is to just repossess docks and piers and the intermodal transportation networks that they built with their loaned money.
And their people often.
And yes, and regularly they move in the workers, so the local people get very few jobs. Might they be seeing that it's very easy to overplay your hand in this? Because it smacks of neocolonialism. If China starts taking over ports in East Africa, taking over railroads in Kenya, and so on.
Yes, there's some hope there. The question, but thus far, I don't believe they may not be acting to seize. They also have not been eager to renegotiate the terms. So I think some of what they may be watching, and where I said there's a window of opportunity, the United States, European, others need to act swiftly and smartly to seize those opportunities, because yes, China may be overplaying its hand. China also knows how to renegotiate if they need to. And if you're sitting in a country that has some of these key resources and you have the mindset that was betting on the future of your country and not just lining your own pocket, and I recognize those are big caveats, you could play the United States and Europe off of China to really get deals that could shape the future of the entire continent, never mind just your country. You are holding the keys to the kingdom right now if you're sitting in those countries. And it's why we, the United States, need to be working, and I believe we have at least some folks who are at an accelerated pace to figure out how we can be the best partner to get some of the stuff.
You've teed me up beautifully, because I've been curious about, you're in meetings, you're in consultations, you're in councils where this stuff is hashed over. Does anyone, and maybe it's you, stand up in the meetings and just point out in horror or in frustration that part of the chronic instability in that powder keg group of nations is economic failure and governance failure, that the temperature in these places would go way down if these places weren't so badly led and people weren't working so hard for so little in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, in Lebanon. I mean, it's a long roll call of dishonor. People have not been able to take advantage of this rise of the rest that we see going on around the rest of the world. And the Middle East is, in many ways, as messed up as it's ever been.
Yes, there are people in most meetings I've been in and outside of government, who raise those issues in various ways. But at least when you're in government, you got to figure out what to do about it now in real time. And when you have the luxury of being outside, and we talk about this all the time at Center for American Progress, I think that we are misusing the luxury we have of being outside and dealing with these issues if we spend the bulk of our time admiring the problem. I think it's really important to analyze it and understand what the factors are, and then figure out what can you do about it and what's the pathway. To me, some of the pathways are taking the time to figure out where the other guy is and what's causing the other guy, the leaders in the other country, people in the countries that we're trying to deal with things as they are, figure out what can we do that can move quickly with the institutions we have to make things better on the ground. So yes, that's foreign assistance, but our foreign assistance and our development agencies work more slowly and take a lot of time. And so that's why, to me, some of the near-term options are putting together investments in a way that help us in the United States and help the people in those countries, and target specific countries where we can actually get some near-term gains that folks in the country on the ground can see and feel the difference for. And that will help us in making those kinds of arrangements in other places as well. So I think it's a way to look at where your challenges are and what your opportunities are for overcoming them.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, Mara Rudman talks about Israel's changing political relationships and the role the U.S. could play in the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Israel is striking deals with Gulf states that look outwardly very different from the kind of chilly peace they've had with Egypt. Are they?
Yes, and their relationship with Egypt, by the way, is actually pretty warm. It may not be warm between the peoples, but it became less and less chilly over the time period of the Obama administration. And in some ways, and I say this with deep affection for all of my colleagues in the Obama administration and President Obama, we did more in bringing that region together with Israel, not in opposition to the United States, but because of their shared unhappiness with the United States policies and directions than I think had occurred previously. So I would say Israel's relationship with the Gulf and Egypt and Morocco, I mean, this is warming up now, but Israel did something very smart in terms of, in all politics is local, right? They just recognized Morocco's claim over Western Sahara, which for the Moroccans, Morocco and Algeria over Western Sahara is like Israeli-Palestinian. It's as existential as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there's all sorts of different kind of gatherings, and also goes back to what you mentioned about Iran earlier, because the alliances in that region between Israel, Gulf states, and others are also juxtaposed against the concern and threat that they see Iran as posing.
Syria continues to be a place of tremendous human suffering and decline, and Bashar al-Assad's government was welcomed back into the Arab League. What's that about?
A lack of other options. The story of Syria is really a tragic one, and it is one that I would say many actors in the region share responsibility for, and certainly the United States, Russia, others, I think, share responsibility for where things ended up. It also is part of a bigger dynamic in what the Arab Spring was and wasn't, and the lack of ability of parties outside the region to understand and appreciate the dynamics in each country and be able to modulate policies based on what was happening in each country, because there are different dynamics everywhere. And not that the United States or Europe or Russia could control the dynamics in each country, but I think we were caught by surprise at the dynamics and then had real challenges in adapting during that time period.
Has the discourse around Israel in the United States kept up with the times? Do Israel's changing political relationships in the Middle East undermine the ability of the U.S. government to influence Israel's behavior toward the Palestinian people and their land?
So that question begs the question of what is the ability of the United States to influence in any given situation, not just between Israelis and Palestinians. In some ways, I am heartened by the confidence that people seem to have, and not just the American people, in what I would describe as outsized influence for the United States to change factors on the ground in other countries. So I would say that first. I actually think we have an opportunity through the Abraham Accords. And there is very little I would credit the Trump administration with. I would say the Abraham Accords were a good step. As I had noted earlier, it was a step that was made possible by the work of several presidents before President Trump that laid the groundwork. But to actually have the Abraham Accords work as they were intended in terms of economic and possibly security relationships throughout that region, if the United States can work and convince some of the Arab countries currently in the Abraham Accords, who have agreed to the Abraham Accords, and some like Saudi Arabia that people really want to get in, to have as a prerequisite for going forward significant improvements for Palestinians and Palestinian life, livelihoods, economy, and future, getting a political outcome back on the horizon, the Abraham Accords could and should be a vehicle for doing that. So I guess I would say the question around that, it's a question of how to most effectively use the influence and impact the United States has. And you always got to adapt to where your facts are on the ground and how they've changed. And so that is, to me, the current window of opportunity for us.
That's Mara Rudman from American Progress. Thanks a lot, Mara. It's been a pleasure looking back and forward with you.
Thanks. Enjoyed the conversation, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Maya Kegley, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. A special thanks to Chris Dobson at World Affairs and the team at the Marines Memorial Association. It was fact-checked by our intern, Adam Ailey. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.